My pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the day to you, Owen Ware, who obtained his PhD in Toronto in 2010 and who is currently assistant professor at the Simon Fraser University. His interests cover mainly ethics, Kantian and post-Kantian philosophy, and in this area of interest, about this area of interest will be his talk today. Also, it's always good to start your day with a bit of moral philosophy. So we'll be hearing Owen Ware with Skepticism in Kant's Grounding of Morality.
Thank you. So I want to begin with this quotation from the first critique that will sort of be capturing one of the main ideas that I want to be developing in this talk. So this is where Kant says, "The objections that are to be feared lie in ourselves. We must search them out like old but unexpired claims." It is astonishing that in a book as ambitious as Kant's Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, we do not find the skeptic's traditional question, why be moral? It is also unfortunate, I believe, since it leaves us without a clear sense of the problem Kant sets out to address. As readers, we find ourselves asking, what question was Kant interested in, if not the skeptics, and who was he speaking to? A number of commentators have taken Kant's silence on these matters as evidence that he was uninterested in the sort of concerns that preoccupy ethical and meta-ethical theorizing today. John Rawls, for example, was convinced that Kant did not wish to confront a radical moral skeptic. That was not a problem for him, however much it may trouble us. Similarly, Thomas Hill has suggested that Kant's aim in section 3 of the Groundwork is easily obscured by the fact that his audience was not the sort of skeptic or amoralist we are familiar with. He did not take himself to be responding to those, quote, who are indifferent to morality and demand that philosophy supply them with a motive to be moral. Related comments appear in the work of Alan Wood, Jens Timmerman, and Henry Allison. There are a few exceptions to this trend in the scholarship. Michael Forster and Paul Guyer have argued that Kant is actively engaged with a variety of skeptics from the tradition of Humean, Cartesian, and Pyrrhonian origin. In Guyer's view, Rawls and Hill are, quote, right to suggest that the project of the Groundwork is not to justify the universal and binding demands of morality to someone who alleges no presumption in their favor. But it would be wrong to conclude from this that Kant's argument is not intended as an answer to moral skepticism as Kant understood it. According to Guyer, Kant is responding to a number of skeptical opponents in his writings, including the ancient Stoics and Epicureans, as well as Wolff, Baumgarten, Hobbes, Hume, and others. My intention here is to explore a new position within this debate. While I agree that Kant's aim in the Groundwork is anti-skeptical, contrary to Rawls and Hill, I do not want to characterize it in adversarial terms. To borrow Crispin Wright's description, Kant is not trying to defeat, quote, a real philosophical opponent, the skeptic, in rational debate. In my view, framing Kant's ethics in adversarial terms obscures something fundamental to his approach, his view that the skeptic most worth addressing lies within ourselves. Thus, I will argue that Kant is not speaking to the philosophical tradition in any straightforward sense. On my reading, Kant uses a skeptical method in the Groundwork as a way of exposing certain obstacles in our ordinary and philosophical thinking about morality. The central obstacle he is interested in is practical in character, arising from a natural tendency we have to rationalize against the moral law. In attempting to resolve this tendency, I will argue, the Groundwork turns out to have a profoundly educative task. So just to clarify in advance, I want to suggest that the central problem that's animating the Groundwork is practical in the sense that it afflicts us from a pre-theoretical point of view. So that would be different than a skeptical problem that's theoretical. in the sense that it arises in the course of rational speculation. So I begin with some preliminaries, and I want to clarify what I mean by Kant's skeptical method. So Kant says little about his plan of organization in the groundwork beyond the procedural distinction he draws between sections 1 and 2, called analytic, and section 3, called synthetic. In the preface, he states, quote, "I have adopted in this work the method that is, I believe, most suitable if one wants to proceed analytically from common cognition to the determination of its supreme principle, and in turn synthetically from the examination of this principle and its sources back to the common cognition in which we find it used." After this, Kant presents us with the following outline, and I put this on the handout. So he writes, first section, transition from common to philosophical, moral, rational cognition. Second section, transition from popular moral philosophy to metaphysics of morals. In the third section, he calls final step from metaphysics of morals to the critique of pure practical reason. In what follows, I will propose that Kant strategically develops a skeptical problem within each section in order to make a shift of frameworks, or transition, Übergang, necessary. This opens up a simple yet effective way for interpreting the groundwork's inner structure and organization. In section 1, Kant develops a problem in the framework of common human reason with its pre-reflective understanding of morality that only a transition to philosophical reason can overcome. In section 2, he develops a problem in the framework of popular moral philosophy with its empirical a posteriori method that only a transition to a metaphysics of morals can overcome. Finally, in section 3, Kant shows that a metaphysics of morals is also limited with its conceptual a priori method in a way that demands a critical examination or critique of our faculty of reason. So, as we shall see, one advantage to this reading is that it explains what motivates each transition in the book. By invoking possible doubts at the level of our ordinary and philosophical thinking about morality, Kant is able to drive his argument forward to its final critical step. While it may seem speculative to attribute this strategy to Kant, there is textual evidence to support it. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant argues that skeptical claims pose a threat to our philosophical commitments, even if they have not been voiced by a real person. Their seed, as he puts it, lies in human reason itself. Because of this, Kant says it is our responsibility to seek out those claims ourselves, to discover them by using what he calls a skeptical method. The basic idea is that we must take up the position of a skeptic, and if necessary, to think up objections which have not yet occurred to any opponent. In a similar vein, Kant is reported to have said during lecture that as harmful as skepticism is, quote, the skeptical method is just as useful and purposeful, provided one understands nothing more by this than the way of treating something as uncertain and of bringing it to the highest uncertainty in the hope of getting on the trail of truth in this way. Of course, Kant does not make this method explicit in the groundwork, but I believe it clarifies his overall approach. For one thing, it explains why he does not name any historical skeptic in the book. Kant himself may be acting the part with the conviction that the skeptic most worth addressing comes from within us. After all, as he puts it, the objections we should fear most lie in ourselves. So I begin with skepticism in groundwork 1. And essentially what I'm going to be doing here, my first aim in this talk is really to illuminate the transition structure of the groundwork as a whole. So I'm going to be covering a fair bit of territory. But it leads to my second aim, which is to argue that the central obstacle and problem that Kant is trying to address in the groundwork is of a practical nature. It afflicts us pretty theoretically. So using this interpretive framework as my guide, I will begin with the initial obstacle facing common reason. Then I'll show why a transition to philosophical reason overcomes it. Kant only reveals a deeper problem in common reason at the end of section 1, our tendency to rationalize against the moral law. I will outline that tendency and show why it gives us a practical need to seek help, as Kant puts it, in philosophy. So section 1 of the groundwork opens with the well-known claim that a good will is the only thing we can call good without limitation. Riches and power are only good when they are possessed by a person with a good will. Happiness, which may seem to be good for everyone who receives it, is only objectively good, Kant is claiming, on the condition that one is worthy of it. Even characteristics like intelligence and a calm disposition lack intrinsic worth, for it is easy to find examples of intelligent people bent on evil designs or courageous people leading criminal lives. So without going into the details of this claim, I only want to point out that Kant takes up the standpoint of common reason in the 4th paragraph, and he does so in response to the following skeptical worry, and this is on the handout. He writes, "There is, however, something so strange in this idea of the absolute worth of a mere will, in the estimation of which no allowance is made for any usefulness, that despite all the agreement, even of common understanding with this idea, a suspicion must yet arise that its covert basis is perhaps mere high-flown fantasy, and that we may have misunderstood the purpose of nature in assigning reason to our will as its governor." What is strange is not so much the idea that we have a vocation to cultivate a will that is good, but that acting under it might require us to sacrifice our well-being. This is what Kant anticipates the reader will react to. How could it be rational to give up everything we hold dear for the sake of a higher vocation? There is something baffling about this, so much so that Kant says we are likely to suspect that the idea of a good will rests on an illusion. The structure of section 1 takes shape as a response. We shall, Kant asserts, put this idea to the test. This test draws on resources Kant assumes are available to common reason. One is an idea he thinks everyone has about organized life, that each component of a living being is best adapted to its final end. This is a claim about nature's purposiveness. Kant uses it to show first that a rational creature with a hedonic vocation could not be responsible for planning its own happiness. For such a hypothetical creature, nature would have blundered in giving it a rational faculty for seeking the ends of inclination, even, Kant adds, for seeking their best means of fulfillment. Yet a blunder in nature contradicts its purposiveness. On this scenario, then, nature would have been sure to appoint instinct the role of governing the creature's will, and it would have been careful to assign reason a passive function, that is, to self-consciously admire the efficiency of instinct, not to break forth into the sphere of action. Why is reason so ill-suited for the task of happiness? Kant asks us to look at people who have tried to devote themselves to a hedonic vocation. In his view, the more a cultivated reason purposefully occupies itself with the enjoyment of life and with happiness, so much the further does a human being get away from true satisfaction. This shows that putting our rational faculties into the service of our sensible nature is counterproductive. It can likely have the effect of multiplying the number of our inclinations, driving us further away from our goal. Kant believes this is true even for people who have devoted themselves to so-called higher pleasures. They often end up bringing more trouble upon themselves instead of gaining in happiness. Soon, he writes, they envy rather than despise the more common run of people who are closer to the guidance of mere natural instinct and do not allow their reason much influence on their behavior. After making these observations, Kant shifts subjects. Reason is nevertheless given to us as a practical faculty, that is, as one that is to influence the will. The shift is easy to miss, however. At this section of the text, Kant is no longer speaking about a hypothetical creature. He is now speaking about a human being. For us, reason does break forth into the sphere of action. And that is enough to show, from the standpoint of common reason, that our vocation cannot be merely to pursue pleasure. It would be inconsistent with the wisdom of nature to assign an active rational capacity to a being destined for happiness. So according to nature's purposiveness, our vocation must be different. As Kant says, where nature has everywhere gone else to work purposefully in distributing its capacities, the true vocation of reason must be to produce a will that is good, not perhaps as a means to other purposes, but good in itself, for which reason was absolutely necessary. Aside from the question of how compelling this test is, we might wonder what else remains to be shown in Section 1. It seems that common reason has all the resources it needs to justify our higher vocation. The claim of nature's purposiveness, combined with the alleged fact that reason is practical for us, shows that it is consistent to assign unlimited value to a mere will. Why does Kant not think this is enough? Recall that the skeptical worry that I mentioned earlier is that our vocation may rest on an illusion that its underlying idea, a will that is good without limitation, may be a product of the imagination. While the test shows the consistency of these claims from the standpoint of common reason, it does not clarify the principle of a good will. This highlights an obstacle in our ordinary moral thinking. We are unable to render the principle of our higher vocation explicit. A transition, Übergang, to philosophical thinking is needed to show this. Kant's claim is more modest than it sounds, however. The transition in Section 1 is only meant to clarify what we already know. He says that we have to explicate the concept of a will that is to be esteemed in itself and that is a good apart from any further purpose, as it already dwells in natural, sound understanding. We need philosophical thinking to do this because it contains the right conceptual tools. Thus, Kant's strategy is to analyze how someone with a good will must act when faced with desires coming from his sensible nature. The result is that we set before ourselves the concept of duty, which Kant says contains that of a good will, though under certain subjective limitations and hindrances, which, however, far from concealing it and making it unrecognizable, rather bring it out by contrast and make it shine forth all the more brightly. By proceeding in this way, Kant is able to show that the principle a good will must act on is the moral law, and that its primary motive must be a feeling of respect for this law. Aware of how abstract this sounds, Kant quickly reminds us that we do not necessarily have a conscious grasp of the moral law in our everyday lives. It is rather the implicit normative standard of our judgments, a standard Kant thinks we employ whenever we appraise an action's inner worth. This is why philosophical thinking, in the context of Groundwork 1, does not teach us anything we did not already know. With this compass in hand, Kant explains, common reason knows very well how to distinguish in every case that comes up what is good and what is evil, what is in conformity with duty or contrary to it. The transition to philosophical reason in Section 1 is a transition within common reason itself. But there is a problem here. In our everyday frame of mind, we are prone to self-deception. We can easily delude ourselves into thinking that happiness should have priority over moral claims. As a result, common reason falls into what Kant calls a natural dialectic. It starts to rationalize against those strict laws of duty and to cast doubt upon their validity, or at least upon their purity and strictness. This is a different problem than before. By subverting the moral law from a position of authority, we are susceptible to a genuine error of deliberation, that of reversing the priority of moral claims so that considerations of our happiness retain superiority from a practical point of view. We are susceptible, that is, to an excess of self-love. Unfortunately, Kant is not clear how this excess arises. At first, it appears that the source of our propensity to rationalize against the moral law is born from the desires we have as sensible beings. But on closer inspection, this does not hold up. To see why, consider what Kant says. I quote, "The human being feels within himself a powerful counterweight to all the demands of duty. which reason represents to him as so deserving of the highest respect, the counterweight of his needs and inclinations, the entire satisfaction of which he sums up under the name happiness. So this last sentence here ends with an important qualification. Kant is not speaking of our needs and inclinations taken individually, but of the conception we have of their total satisfaction. Later, in section 2 of the groundwork, Kant will define happiness as the ideal of one day having our wants and wishes fulfilled. The ideal is empty, however. He also refers to it as an ideal of the imagination. This ideal is empty because it does not specify in advance what will make us satisfied. We still need experience to figure out how to bring our inclinations into harmony with each other. This is a small yet significant point of clarification. It shows that the dialectic of common reason does not lie between the moral law and the inclinations. Our inclinations, taken individually, do not present us with an end. Instead, the dialectic arises between the two ends we have as beings who are both rational and sensible, namely between morality and our own happiness. They are set in opposition in Kant's view because the demands of morality do not promise anything to our desires. Viewed from the perspective of common reason, then, the strict laws of duty seem to insult us, to show, as Kant puts it, disregard and contempt for the interest we have in our well-being. It is only natural, then, that we will try to defend this interest by striking back, that is, by stripping moral laws of their very authority. So that's how I understand the nature of this natural dialectic. So I turn now to skepticism in groundwork 2. In section 2, Kant calls upon philosophy for a second time. Before, we needed tools of philosophical analysis to clarify the principle guiding our everyday view of a good will's worth. This was more or less a theoretical need. But having identified a natural dialectic in our ordinary thinking, Kant now argues we need philosophy on practical grounds. We need help in resolving our tendency to rationalize against the moral law. As we shall see, the question framing section 2 of the groundwork is what kind of philosophical method is fit for this task. And here Kant criticizes what he calls popular moral philosophy because it plays into the hands of skepticism. So now I will discuss the character of the skepticism in more detail. Then I will show how Kant uses the threat it poses to advocate his own less popular alternative. And that will, of course, be what he calls a metaphysics of morals. In the opening pages of section 2, Kant introduces two unnamed skeptics. He actually speaks of groups of people here, but I will refer to one skeptic from each camp. The first does not deny the truth or correctness of the moral law. Kant tells us his doubts concern human nature. In his view, we are unable to live up to the moral law's demands, and so he is skeptical about our motivational capacities. Kant describes this philosopher as speaking with deep regret that human nature is noble enough to take as its precept an idea so worthy of respect, but at the same time is too weak to follow it. It is not that he thinks the moral law is impure, for example, that duty is mixed up with self-interest, but that we are imperfect and so incapable of regarding duty as our incentive. The thought that troubles him is not that moral principles lack validity, but that we lack the capacity to be successfully moved by them. Kant's second skeptic raises a different concern. Rather than express deep regret over the moral weakness of our will, he harbors a malicious wish to, quote, ridicule all morality as a mere phantom of a human imagination, overstepping itself through self-conceit. In his eyes, the evidence we have of people's conduct is decisive. We frequently meet individuals who use the appearance of morality to hide their selfish motives. From this, the second skeptic concludes that there is nothing behind the appearance, no objective ground from which the claims of duty can bind us. The everyday experience of moral obligation, he argues, is not a product of reason, it is an illusion of the imagination. Despite their differences, Kant's point is that each skeptic commits the same error. Both rest their doubts on experience. For the first skeptic, it is the evidence of our weakness of will, the fact that we seem incapable of regarding duty as an incentive that questions our ability to live up to the moral law's commands. For the second skeptic, it is the evidence of our selfishness, the fact that we often disguise our motives under the mask of virtue that questions moral objectivity itself. In section 2, Kant uses a method of exaggeration to undermine these concerns. First, he admits we cannot know for certain whether our actions have a moral motive or a motive drawn from self-love. It may be the case that our actions are but effects of what Kant calls the dear self, which he says is always turning up. But Kant's point is that it would be wrong to draw any conclusions from this. The fact that we cannot find examples of our moral strength of will does not support the inference that we lack the capacity for such strength. Nor does the fact that people more often than not use morality for their selfish purposes support the inference that morality is entirely subjective. By exaggerating their worries, Kant's aim is to uncover the fallacy these philosophers share in common, the fallacy of thinking that what we cannot perceive must not exist. Kant thinks we can learn a general lesson from this. The general lesson is that we cannot settle questions about morality on the basis of experience. Observations of people's behavior cannot determine what we are motivationally capable of, nor do they give us purchase on normative claims about how we should act. For example, that we should only attend to the interests of the inclinations. Admittedly, when we look out into the world, we see that people, including ourselves, often act selfishly. We needn't be cynical in making such reports. Yet the important point is this: if we cannot know whether our actions proceeded from a moral motive or a motive drawn from self-love, and if empirical evidence cannot distinguish between the two, then we cannot know from experience whether we have the capacity to act from duty. So if we try to counter the skeptic by offering examples of allegedly good conduct, we will in turn commit the same mistake the skeptic has made. We will develop our stance, which may purport to be anti-skeptical, on the assumption that we can settle moral questions from an empirical point of view, and that would draw us back into the very problem we wish to escape. What is at stake then at the beginning of section 2 is a question of proper philosophical procedure. As we read further, we see that Kant's criticism is aimed not so much at skepticism, but at a moral theory that subscribes to an empirical method. This is what Kant calls popular moral philosophy, a theory based on what he calls a disgusting hodgepodge of patchwork observations, some drawn from reason, others from experience. Since popular philosophy assumes we can gain insight into virtue by observing others and finding examples of good conduct, it is left defenseless against those who wish to cast doubt upon our higher vocation. Once again, Kant's point is that experience cannot be our testing ground for morality and virtue, and he puts this point nicely in the first critique, where he writes, "Whoever would draw the concepts of virtue from experience, whoever would make what can at best serve as an example for imperfect illustration into a model from which to derive knowledge, as many have actually done, would make of virtue an ambiguous non-entity, changeable with time and circumstances, useless for any sort of rule." No wonder then that popular philosophy fails to secure a foundation for morality. Once we see this, Kant thinks, it is clear why we need an alternative method, even one that risks unpopularity. Kant's solution is simple. If an empirical method fails to secure a foundation for morality, then we must see if we can do better by taking up a different method, a method of rational reflection. In taking up this alternative, we must give up the idea that morality can be derived from some special feature of human nature. As Kant explains, duty is to be practical, unconditional necessity of action, and it must therefore hold for all rational beings, to which alone an imperative can apply to all, and only because of this be also a law for all human wills. Kant announces this new method under the title Metaphysics of Morals, which he also calls pure practical philosophy. A metaphysics of morals does nothing more than conceptual analysis. This is the sense in which it is merely analytic. As Kant puts it, we leave it undecided whether what is called duty is not as such an empty concept. Yet what emerges is unexpected. First, when we think of a practical imperative that abstracts from any interest or inclination, we are led to the formula of universal law. Act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. Second, when we ask what end is objectively valid for all rational beings, we see that it can only be humanity qua rational nature, since only rational nature has a dignity that sets it apart from things with contingent value. According to Kant, this yields the formula of humanity. So act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. Kant now argues that the first and second formulas combine to yield a third. Quickly put, his claim is that when we think of a being adopting humanity as its end, we have the idea of a being legislating itself by reason. That is, we have the idea of a being acting autonomously, free of any interest or inclination. So by reflecting on the concept of a rational will in general, a metaphysics of morals leads us to the formula of autonomy. So act that the maxims of your choice are also included as universal law in the same volition. So without discussing the details of these connections, we can at least appreciate what Kant is trying to achieve in section 2 of the groundwork. Conceptual analysis shows that what the moral law demands of us is neither more nor less than just this autonomy. Had we kept to a popular method of investigation, we would never have been able to grasp this. Despite Kant's frequent reminders that his method in the first two sections of the groundwork is merely analytic, his closing statement in section 2 still comes as a shock. He tells us it is possible at this stage of the argument that the concept of duty may be empty, that morality may be a figment of the imagination. But why is this still a possibility? And why is Kant telling us this now? It may help to remember that Kant thinks we leave ourselves exposed to skepticism if we develop the concept of duty from experience. The problem with popular philosophy is not only that it leaves us with a patchwork of half-rationalized principles, but that its method consists of observing others and finding examples of virtuous conduct. As a result, popular philosophy, in Kant's sense of the word, is left defenseless against those who wish to denounce morality as an illusion, since experience teaches us that people often act from selfish motives. By adopting a rational method of investigation, we have seen that Kant rejects the assumption the two skeptics from section 2 share in common, i.e., that what we cannot perceive must not exist. As he says, quote, "Whoever holds morality to be something and not a chimerical idea without any truth must also admit the principle of morality brought forward." My conjecture is that the new audience consists of whoever has, with Kant, made the transition to a metaphysics of morals. If this is right, his comment about the possible illusoriness of duty serves only as a reminder that a metaphysics of morals is limited. Once again, we can see Kant using a skeptical method to show why a shift of frameworks, or transition, Übergang, is necessary. As a procedure, a metaphysics of morals avoids the pitfalls of popular philosophy. It uncovers conceptual links between our common sense notions of duty and autonomy of will. But within its framework, we cannot decide whether those links are justified. By the end of section 2, it remains to be seen whether the principle of a rational will in general, expressed by the moral law, is also a principle binding for beings like us. For Kant, a special kind of justification is required to show this, what he now calls a deduction. And this brings me to section 3 of the groundwork. So before going forward, let me put a few key points in review. We have seen that in section 2 of the groundwork, Kant is troubled by an approach to morality that leaves itself exposed to skepticism, the approach of popular moral philosophy. This is an important turning point in his argument. Kant has just shown in section 1 that common reason is susceptible to a natural dialectic, which requires it to seek help in philosophy. If common reason turns to popular philosophy for a clarification of its moral commitments, it would likely become more entangled in self-obscurity. This idea is worth repeating because it is easy to forget that one of Kant's central tasks in the groundwork is to rescue common reason from its self-obscurity. As we have seen, the practical need for philosophy only becomes apparent at the end of section 1, when we discover we have a tendency to rationalize against the moral law. That is why Kant says we are compelled to seek help in philosophy, not by some need of speculation, he adds, but on practical grounds themselves, so that we may escape the conflict that inevitably arises between morality and our own happiness. This is also part of Kant's argument leading to the final section of the groundwork. For in the preface he says that the dialectic we suffer in our ordinary thinking will only find rest in a complete critique of our reason. This is part of the final step Kant thinks we need to take in section 3. So what does this step involve? Early in the groundwork, Kant leaves us with a hint. At the end of section 1, he says the need of common reason to seek help in philosophy is similar to the need we have in matters of speculation. Here Kant is alluding to the transcendental dialectic from the first critique, where he shows we suffer from a tendency to overstep the proper bounds of human cognition in seeking knowledge of objects. We fall into what he calls a chaos of uncertainty in laying claim to objects outside any relation to sense experience, to the concept of God, for example. In the groundwork, however, Kant implies that common reason suffers from the opposite problem, and this passage is on your handout. He writes, "Yet we cannot consider without admiration how great an advantage the practical faculty of appraising has over the theoretical in common human understanding. In the latter, if common reason ventures to depart from laws of experience and perceptions of the senses, it falls into sheer incomprehensibilities and self-contradictions, at least into a chaos of uncertainty, obscurity, and instability. But in practical matters, it is just when common understanding excludes all sensible incentives from practical laws that its faculty of appraising first begins to show itself to advantage. In matters of knowledge, our speculative use of reason becomes dialectical when we overstep the sensible conditions that make human cognition possible. By contrast, in matters of deliberation, a practical use of reason displays its authority when we ignore sensuous incentives, for then we can judge an action's worth in terms of its lawful form, stripped of any consideration of self-interest. This means, to bring out the reverse point, that we fall into a chaos of uncertainty, obscurity, and instability when we let sensible incentives encroach upon our practical reason. That is when our self-love becomes excessive and when we begin to quibble with the demands of morality. All of this goes to show why the groundwork needs a final shift of frameworks. If we can show that our faculty of reason has a pure use, separate from its empirical use, then we can see that the only principle legislative for our will is autonomy, that of being a law to ourselves, which is equivalent to morality. A critical examination or critique of this sort would show that our tendency to rationalize against the moral law is without basis. It occurs when we allow what is only a part of ourselves, namely our sensibility, to act as if it constituted ourselves as a whole. If successful, then, Kant's critique would vindicate the idea of our higher vocation first expressed in section 1, ultimately showing that we have not misunderstood the purpose of nature in assigning reason to our will as its governor. It goes without saying that a method of conceptual analysis, which is the method of a metaphysics of morals, is unable to take us this far. So again, that's why we need a final transition in section 3. Although Kant leaves us in the dark here, we can begin to understand his strategy better by looking at the title of subsection 4, within Groundwork 3. The title is, How is a Categorical Imperative Possible? An even more revealing piece of evidence comes a few paragraphs later when Kant draws a parallel to the transcendental deduction of the categories. After summarizing the argument, he says, quote, "This is roughly like the way in which concepts of the understanding, which by themselves signify nothing but lawful form in general, are added to intuitions of the world of sense and thereby make possible synthetic propositions a priori, on which all cognition of a nature rests." If we take Kant at his word, the parallel of a transcendental deduction in section 3 is to be found in his answer to the question of how a moral ought is possible. And this is something we can discuss later, but I think a case can be made to show that there is a parallel in the structure of the transcendental deduction of the categories and the deduction that Kant is offering of the categorical imperative in Groundwork 3. So very briefly, there's controversy, of course, over how Kant wants to organize the transcendental deduction, but on one fairly plausible reading, the proof structure of the argument has two steps. First, Kant wants to show the validity of the categories in their application to a sensible manifold in general, but a second step is still necessary for the transcendental deduction because our sensible manifold is characterized by space and time. So on one reading then, we need a second step, which is the latter half of the transcendental deduction, to show the validity of the categories in their application to our human sensible manifold of intuition. So I'm suggesting here that the parallel to a transcendental deduction of the categories in section 3 centers on this question of how a moral ought is possible. And this makes sense, I think, considering that our cognition of an ought expressed in the moral law provokes the same sort of suspicion raised by the epistemic must in the categories. In both cases, we are faced with claims marked by necessity, and the question is whether these claims have an objective basis. A deduction of the categorical imperative would then explain the peculiar character of morality, the fact that we recognize its claims as binding or constraining us. Now, I want to suggest, as with the argument from the first critique, that Kant's deduction in Groundwork 3 is organized around two steps. The first step introduces different but compatible ways we can view ourselves as agents. On the one hand, when I view myself from the standpoint of an observer in the third person, I see that my actions are part of the same space of causes that I take up when I explain events in a natural world. My actions are a product of forces beyond my control. On the other hand, when I view myself as an agent in the first person, I presuppose a different space, a space of reasons, unaffected by natural influences, including the influences of my sensibility. I recognize that I am not only acted upon, but active myself. Kant uses this distinction to show, first, that when I view myself exclusively from the standpoint of agency, participating in a space of reasons, I cannot derive a principle of action from my inclinations as a sensible being. I am now considering myself outside the space of causes to which my inclinations belong. So the only principle I can derive is that of being a law to myself, and that is the principle of autonomy. As a participant in the space of reasons, then, I see that a principle of being a law to myself is valid for me without the mediation of my inclinations. In this sense, it is the only principle of my will qua will, the only principle I give wholly to myself. Of course, this does not yet show how the moral law is binding for us. The two-standpoint distinction says that when we regard ourselves as agents, we presuppose a space undetermined by sensibility, a space of reasons which Kant speaks of in terms of an intelligible world. Here it follows that practical reason is more than an empirically conditioned faculty. At least we have no reason to suspect that our will might be covertly determined by sensible incentives alone, for we distance ourselves from this space of explanation when we view ourselves from the standpoint of agency. At this point, however, one might object that the moral law is valid for rational beings, and so for ourselves, considered only as participants in the space of reasons. Yet this leaves open the question of whether the moral law applies to beings like us, who are affected by sensibility. So this is why we need the parallel of a second step of the transcendental deduction of the categories, which concerns how the categories apply to our peculiar sensible manifold. Kant's answer, which comprises one of the most difficult parts of the groundwork, turns on the two standpoint distinction outlined above, but his task now is to show how these standpoints relate to each other. He first acknowledges that we are not only members of the space of reasons. We are also beings with inclinations, and so we are also part of the space of causes. However, the point we need to keep in mind is that we do not only belong to the space of causes. We know this from the first step. We are affected by sensible incentives, but not determined by them. Kant's second step turns on this very point. When I act on my inclinations, I must participate in making my choices. I must exercise my freedom by taking my inclinations as reasons for acting. This brings us to the key premise of Kant's deduction in section 3. The idea I have of my will from the space of reasons grounds the conception I have of my will from the space of causes. When I take my inclinations as reasons for acting, I exercise my power of choice, and that presupposes the idea of my will considered purely as a will. The principle of autonomy appears to me as a normative demand then, because it presents to me the idea of my same will, yet unaffected by sensibility, i.e., the idea of my will qua will. This is why the moral ought comes from my own will as a member of the intelligible world. I experience it as an ought only because I must view myself at the same time as part of the world of sense. What Kant's deduction shows then is that my cognition of necessity in the categorical imperative has an objective basis after all. Rather than a figment of my imagination, the moral ought expresses my own pure will. So looking back, we can see why nothing Kant says in the groundwork would satisfy a person looking for a motive to be moral. The argument of section 3 takes up a different question altogether. As Thomas Hill has pointed out, Kant is not speaking to those who are indifferent to morality and demand that philosophy supply them with a motive to be moral. And to this extent, I think Hill and others are right, and that Kant is not trying to refute a radical skeptic or a moralist. His aim is to resolve the dialectic we are prone to succumb to by showing that morality is the principle of our will as a whole, considered in itself, whereas happiness only applies to a part of our will, considered in relation to sensibility. For this reason, we should not look to section 3 of the groundwork for an answer to the skeptic's traditional question, why be moral? If the skeptic is asking how morality will further one of his given desires, then he is begging the whole issue at stake. He is treating morality as a system of hypothetical imperatives, placing his own interests and inclinations in first rank. That is not to say Kant's attitude to skepticism is entirely dismissive in the groundwork. The results of section 3 must speak, at least indirectly, to those who wish to ridicule morality as a figment of the imagination. Like any ordinary person who engages in rationalization, the skeptics Kant considers in section 2 would display a genuine practical error if they asserted their happiness above the moral law. By doing so, they would be lost in the same self-obscurity Kant says common reason finds itself in. So in the end, I believe we can turn the skeptics' words against themselves. If anyone has succumbed to a delusion, as they claim, it is not the moralist, but the skeptic himself, insofar as he has presumed that sensibility constitutes our whole self and happiness our highest end. This is the sense in which our need for philosophy is, as Kant says, practical in nature. Skeptical claims are troubling not because they attack our deepest moral intuitions, but because they resonate with unspoken doubts we feel within ourselves. I've suggested we read Kant's groundwork as a method for invoking such doubts in order to expose and overcome the limits in our ordinary and philosophical thinking about morality. It seems that an actual skeptic stands in need of this help no less than anyone else. Our doubts need to be not refuted, but educated. Thank you.